reader to come forward to read from John chapter 11, verses 17 to 35.
Jesus comforts the sisters of Lazarus. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she had got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also were weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. That's it. Yeah.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Jesus wept, and so can I. Looking at loss, as I mentioned this morning, and that's for people who have died. And we also know that there are so many different types of losses in life, and they can all trigger similar types of feeling. They can merge, they can overlap, they can amplify each other. And losses can be things like a loss of job, retirement, loss of a role perhaps, loss of our health, loss of our youth. Anybody feeling that kind of thing? Loss of a role in church, something we used to do and are no longer doing. And there can even be good losses, things that actually it's a good time to stop doing, but still they can bring out all different types of emotion. Now this morning I wanted to say that you know this already, but I'm not speaking as an expert, as if there could be such a person when it comes to losing loved ones. I'm still learning and know over the years I will need to learn more and more. But I am speaking out of my personal experience of loss of people I have loved and still love. As a minister, I've been alongside many people who have suffered loss, and I've been alongside a number of people as they approach death. Before coming here, when I was the minister in training at Upper Beeding Baptist Church, I'd only ever taken one funeral, and that was of baby Eleanor, who died as she was born. And it was a real shock. It would have been a shock anyway, but for my first funeral, when I saw the tiny white coffin, I had to take a deep breath. But it was a touching, beautiful celebration of such a short life as well. When I came here 14 years ago, I took a funeral nearly every 2 weeks for quite a few months, including the funeral of the minister, Samuel, who had just retired. And I've taken many funerals over the years since. I regard being alongside people as they die, and then alongside their loved ones, as one of the most important parts of my being a minister. It's more than being a minister, being me. It's an absolute privilege. There's not a right word for it, but privilege comes close. I remember with Pat's Jeffrey, Kate and I coming round during those last few days and having the iPhone out and singing along with him to some gospel music. I remember with Beryl's Jerry visiting him at Worthing Hospital and then us going to see him at Brighton Hospital and praying over him. And I remember Doug, Peter, Billy and I praying together with him. Such a beautiful, not a super spiritual time of prayer, just a really down-to-earth, beautiful time of prayer on their balcony. And then praying with him at St. Barnabas as well. Enjoy is the wrong word. But I do cherish, absolutely cherish all of this and taking funerals. It feels ever so special. And as you know, what I notice is people are often, not always, but people are often at their most real, the most open. And all of this, you know me well, doesn't mean that I'm immune to feeling. Far from it. It's all part of it. But I have been okay with whatever feelings have arisen. And thankfully, they haven't overwhelmed me so that I can't be there for those who are suffering with bereavement. And I also know that I can sympathise. Sympathy is when, as you know, you've been through something yourself. It's different to empathy. Empathy is what you imagine to be in somebody else's feet. But I can sympathise because I've suffered loss myself. My personal losses, I was asking Kate about this yesterday, but apart from church family, my traumatic loss was at primary school when I lost Whiskers, my cat. And I remember going to primary school crying. I think I remember talking about this with my children later on in life, and I think the tears came back as well. It can be traumatic, you know that probably as well. But the first person came late in my life, in my 30s, and that was my nan who died in 1998, and then Kate's gran. And then a good friend of mine, Mark, from secondary school, who had multiple sclerosis for over 20 years. He then died when he was 40. And then 15 years ago, my dad. And then 12 years ago, Richard, my father-in-law. Just over a year ago, my mum, Daphne, many of you knew. And then late last year, my oldest sister, Kim, who took her life. With Mark in mind, I remember him coming to faith at Aberdeen Baptist Church. You all thought it was a load of rubbish, but actually his faith was so important to him as he neared death, and for the rest of his life as well, actually. And when he died, yes, because of how bad he was, it was the right time. My dad, this man who never showed feelings really, or not always actually, no, sometimes he did, but I think he thought he had to be a tough policeman anyway. But he came to faith late in life, and a precious moment with him was when I was sitting in the car with him, nearing his death, and he said, "Mike, never thought you'd use this language, it's time to go and be with the Lord." It was the right time, given how his cancer was. And then Richard, who, not surprisingly, having been through Dachau, was an atheist. Not everybody who went through the concentration camps was, but he really struggled with churches. He loved us, and he really respected my ministry and Kate's faith. But he didn't come to faith in a way that I recognise. But I don't know, I'm not God, I often say that. But with his dementia, was it dementia? Yeah, it was dementia. I remember thinking the light of Christ can even reach into the darkest places of dementia. And actually, I have a trust in that. But again, given his decaying mind and body, he died at the right time. And then with my mum, well, she was a character, wasn't she? She had a faith, and I was quite surprised how she did not fear death. She didn't fear, I'm sure she had her moments, but she didn't fear death. And it was absolutely exhausting, but so special being with her overnight as she got closer and closer to dying in the early hours. And Doug would be proud of me, singing Elvis songs. How great thou art. I don't put the Elvis voice on when I sing here, but I put the Elvis voice on for her. And then Kim, my oldest of three sisters, who came to faith many years before me. And perhaps that faith, who knows, evaporated in the darkness of the mental illness that arose during lockdown. And I think in some way her emotional pain was exacerbated by all the deaths in her life, many friends. And she found that so hard to cope with. But I have a peace about Kim that nothing can separate you from the love of God. Thankfully, it's not dependent on our faith, ultimately, but on the faithfulness and love of Christ. It was far too soon, far too young, and I was shocked about how she took her life, as all of us were. But there was also some relief that her incredible torment had ended. I wished it had ended through interventions and medication and therapy and treatment, but sadly and tragically it didn't. Have I cried when I've lost people? Do I cry? I'm asking that question of a person who bawled his eyes out a few years ago in the manse watching Waterloo Road. It's not Oscar performing stuff, Waterloo Road. When Sambuca, a young girl, was dying, and that was much to the amusement of my children. Dad's crying. And a touch of that as well, when they were very little and we lived in Stenning, when I had the job of taking animals to the vets. And I took the rabbit, and I thought, I love the rabbit, but it's fine. And then as I walked out the vets, because it had to be put down, I was bawling and bumped into some neighbours. And it was the upset of knowing how upset Kate and the children would be. But crying was something I had to learn to do. And it was things like movies and books and animals, death of animals. That really helped. I used to do that deflection thing, where you feel sad, but you notice somebody else crying, and you say, oh, look, you've got a tear in your eye. Did that for years. And actually, I see many people do that, and often men do that for some reason. But now I try not to hide from my emotions, however difficult they may be, even though pain and loss is always pain and loss. And each new loss can bring up previous losses, although perhaps less so when we have grieved in a healthy way those previous losses. But whatever the case, Jesus wept, and so can I. I found this Bible story, that verse in particular, ever so comforting. Not that we need permission, but it's the Son of God in the flesh giving us permission to feel whatever we feel when somebody dies. We might have confusing feelings. We might feel guilt. We might feel relief. We might feel anger. We might feel numbness. Whatever we feel, we feel. Whatever we feel, we feel. For example, my stepmother also died last year, and I had conflicted feelings about her throughout my life. And at her death, if I'm honest, I have conflicted feelings as well. But that's okay, whatever you feel, you feel. This text is remarkable. So Jesus, with his disciples, hears about the illness of one of the family, Lazarus, that he loves. And then there's this bit of confusion when he says he's gone to sleep, and people think, oh, well, if he sleeps, he'll get better. And Jesus makes it very clear, after he stayed 2 days away. Very strange, but there's logic to it, I'm sure. that he's died. And actually, Jesus, in his understanding, is pleased he didn't go straight away because he knows what is going to happen. He knows about Lazarus coming back to life. And it's going to be for the glory of God and through the glory of the Father, through the Son, and to increase the faith of his disciples. Something I really love is the Greek text in this story. The word for deeply moved and troubled in extra biblical writings, that word is used to describe the snorting of a horse, a war horse. Imagine a snorting horse. Jesus was deeply moved. He saw Mary crying and he wept. He saw the other Jews around mourning and crying. He wept for Lazarus, but he wept with them as well. He was angry. He was angry. I believe there's many different theories, but I believe he was angry at death itself because death actually is not right. It is not in the order of things. And thank God through Christ, it's not the end of the story. I know for some of you, but I also wonder what experience of loss you have had. I imagine it's a mix of pain, healthy grieving, difficulties in grieving, repression, and all the stuff that we all kind of go through in some way. My talking about this morning, I recognised in doing this, it was through faith that it would bring up emotions for all of us, perhaps. And that's okay. That's okay. And I really do trust that the Spirit is at work today and would be at work and will be at work afterwards, bringing about healthiness, perhaps some kind of freeing, even if it's difficult. Came across a lovely quote from Charles Spurgeon yesterday. Those who dive in the sea of affliction bring up rare pearls. Speaking today, I knew was at risk of me crying, but that's okay. It's all part of our culture here at Worthing Baptist Church. We do tears. Jesus wept, and so can I. Some thoughts about a healthier approach to death and loss. First of all, not denying death. Father Richard Rohr, I love what he says about death. Before we accept the inevitability of death, we're not free to live our lives. And he talks about healthy rituals in other countries where, for one tribe, they used to actually, when the children were coming towards adulthood, bury them to give them a taste of death, like a ritual. But then as they came out, they were adults and they could face the rest of their life because they had faced death. In the Western culture, we know this. As a whole, we like to live in denial. We use phrases like they've passed away. Have you noticed I don't do that when I give a notice? That is a choice not to do that. They had a good innings. I've heard of people saying that other people have crossed the road after they've lost a loved one to avoid the discomfort. And perhaps more understandable, we can fall into the pattern of not mentioning the name of the person who has died because we don't want to feel uncomfortable. We think we might upset somebody, but actually the bereaved is often left thinking, have they been forgotten then? Christians do a lot of good, but sometimes we can add to all of this an unhealthy religious slant. They've gone to a better place. True, but don't help sometimes. God needed them in heaven. Have you heard words to that effect? I love Joseph and the Technicolor, but there's one more angel in heaven, one more star in the sky. It's dodgy theology if nothing else. Went to a prayer meeting, not here, but after somebody lost their child in a tragic accident. And a well-meaning elderly lady prayed out loud in the group, Lord, you know what's best, and you decided to take them early. And I was there thinking, no, he didn't. That's not my theology anyway. He didn't arrange the crash. When people are terminally ill, and we've probably all experienced this, sometimes well-meaning Christians will get alongside them and promise healing on behalf of God. And I've seen all manners of devastation when that goes on. The truth is, death is real, it's messy, there are no easy answers, and answers that come easily are often trite. All kinds of emotions arise, including fear. And this is the scary thing. Death challenges our illusion that we're in control. We like to do everything in life to make us feel like we're in control. We ain't. But there's beauty in that as well, because it's in that very lack of control that we are invited to lean into God, to lean into Almighty God, the loving arms of Almighty God, in surrender, in trust. My encouragement this morning to myself and to all of us is not to repress emotions, even if it's messy. And I know they can come at any time, and I know that they can come years afterwards as well, and sometimes in surprising ways. When you're in the queue at Asda doing your shopping and suddenly you get a wave of that emotion, or if you're a bit posher than me, when you're in Waitrose. Be encouraged. Jesus' response was messy, emotional. So even if we snort in our distress, even if we have snot covering our faces, even if our makeup runs, it's not a weakness. It's not letting anybody down, and it is nothing to do with a lack of faith. I'll tell you what it is. It's good modelling for other people that we know. It's good modelling for all the youngsters that we might know in life as well. Healthy grieving. If we don't grieve. Before I trained in counselling, before I had any losses, when I started my probation career, 30 odd years ago, I remember somebody from Cruse, the bereavement charity that support people, saying they have noticed people after 30 years of losing somebody, they're still holding it all together, not dealing with it, and it's coming out in all kinds of odd ways, including alcohol misuse, drug misuse, and all that kind. It doesn't go away. I was speaking to a dermatologist the other day, and they were saying that with the sun, with ultraviolet, each of us has like a glass that gets filled up over life, and it doesn't go anywhere. There's only a certain amount of ultraviolet that our skin can take. It just gets more and more and more. And I think loss can be like that. If we don't grieve healthily, it just builds and builds and builds. Jesus wept, and so can I. How can church be of help? Well, for sure, we can't take the pain away, but we can choose to be alongside each other. And the healthier more of us are with death, with loss, the more comforting in a real way we can be with each other. And thank God we don't need clever words, because there aren't clever enough words. Thank God we don't have to give trite answers, because there are often no answers. We can sympathise. Those of us who have lost people, we can sympathise, but at the same time not fall into thinking we understand exactly how that person feels. We can empathise if we haven't lost somebody. We can imagine through our other losses in life what loss might feel like. We can cry together. Is it okay to cry together? Jesus cried with Mary, with Martha, with the other mourners. Crying together is beautiful. Again, one of the tips I learned as a counsellor: have tissues in the room, but when somebody's crying, never ever offer them a tissue. Because the unspoken dynamic that is going on is you're telling them to stop crying. Clean yourself up. I think that's important. Let people feel what they feel. As church, And outside of church, let's talk about those that we've lost. Let's share those memories. Let's have a laugh. And that was such courage of Billy to do that this morning. And I guess my hunch is part of the reason she did that in honour of Doug, but also because she loves you. And this is all part of healthiness. Even if we risk tears, celebration of life services and the committal are also important. And that's why it was so hard during lockdown. Rituals. The Spirit of God can be at work in simple rituals like lighting a candle. And let, in a real way, not a cringy, not a Christianese kind of way, but we are here to remind each other of the hope that we have in Jesus. Jesus wept, and so can we. He was disturbed, deeply moved in spirit, troubled and angry. And so can we be. Whatever we feel, we feel. We can also be a signpost to people outside of the church that can be a fantastic help with bereavement. Some of them are in the news sheet. And finally, how might faith help with all of this? I wonder how your faith helps with all this. I have seen some people who are dying and their faith has been a great comfort. To be honest, I've seen those who really, really struggle as well. I find it so comforting to know that God knows firsthand what grief is like, because God was made flesh in Jesus. In Isaiah, it was predicted that Messiah would come and that he would be a man of sorrows, acquainted with our own grief and pain. And he was, with Lazarus, sharing and bearing it to the point of tears. And I also wonder, as can go on for us, if past grief was coming to mind for Jesus, coming to heart for Jesus, the loss of his earthly father, Joseph. Maybe it was stirring up the thought of his own coming death as well. N.T. Wright, wonderful bishop, says this. When Paul, who wrote Thessalonians, when Paul says he doesn't want us to grieve like people who have no hope, he doesn't mean that he doesn't want us to grieve at all. I'm sure that has been taken out of context many times. He means that there are two sorts of grief, a hopeless grief and a hopeful grief. But hopeful grief is still grief. It can still be, N.T. Wright says, very, very bitter. It's real, but it makes a difference. Let me draw this together. Jesus wept, and so can I, and so can you, so can we. What a wonderful other verse that Jesus utters. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. In all the funerals I take, whenever I am alongside somebody dying, whenever I lose people, friends, family, it is this that comforts and sustains and gives hope. But it's learning to trust the truth of that. Through Christ, the sting of death has gone. Not the pain, but the ultimate power of death has gone. Through his death and resurrection, there is the promise that we will be raised again together. But Jesus had to learn to trust the Father and the Spirit as well. When he says to the disciples, we're going to go to Judea, we're going to go to Bethany, and he knew what God had in mind. But it wasn't, shabam, I'm going to do a magic trick. It's all, Jesus had to go there, knowing he was going closer to his death by going nearer Jerusalem, and knowing that when he uttered the words after the rock was moved, Lazarus, come forward, come out. It was all by faith, learning to trust the Father at a deeper level. So us learning to trust God in our losses, in our own death. If you wobble, that's okay. I wobble too. It's an ongoing journey that we are invited to keep on trying to trust Jesus, the Spirit, and Father God more and more. And we can have bad days, that's okay as well. Faith and doubt go in hand sometimes. Please hear these words for one final time. Jesus wept, and so can we. Amen. I'm going to invite the musicians back for our final song.